Hello guys, sometimes the video might be smaller, sometimes the videos might be bigger. It's all okay. Practically it's the difference whether I have my external monitor or not. But today we are going to be starting American Presidential Elections of American History, Part 2. If you're new to the series, please go watch Part 1. Um, Basically, I will be voting in each presidential election in American history, assuming I was alive at that time. I am,
Beat present.
again, disclaimer, I am biased, and again, disclaimer, I do not have permission for Mr. Beat to show his videos, but I'm reacting to them anyway. Shout out to him, by the way, go subscribe, like, all of that. So let's get started.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 8th presidential election in American history took place from Friday, November 1st to Wednesday, December 4th, 1816. Deciding to play it cool like predecessors Jefferson and Washington, Madison decided not to run for a third term. His second term had been heavily influenced by the War of 1812, and he proved to be a solid leader during it. After the war was over, even though the United States hadn't won, Americans still felt pretty good about how they were able to defend themselves against the British, all things considered. It was the beginning of the so-called era of good feelings, and the nationalism that swept the country during that time at least temporarily helped unite it. Simply put, Madison was popular, and James Monroe, Madison's Secretary of State, who now wanted to take Madison's place, was also popular. The Federalists, meanwhile,
We're not so popular.
because many of them talk trash about involvement in the war, and especially because some of them even talk trash about seceding from the Union. At the series of meetings known as the Hartford Convention, many Americans turned their backs on the Federalist Party. Ironically, the biggest complaints at the Hartford Convention stemmed from the fact that the federal government was gaining power. In fact, Madison had changed his mind on things when he was president that made him sound more like a traditional Federalist. For example, he began favoring a national bank and protective tariffs. If prominent Democratic Republicans were now acting like Federalists, what was the point of having both parties? The Federalists didn't even officially nominate anyone for president in 1816. With the Federalist Party now pretty much out of the picture, the Democratic Republicans prepared for a landslide victory. Many names popped up other than James Monroe for the nomination. Many wanted House Speaker Henry Clay and the Battle of New Orleans hero Andrew Jackson to run, but both declined. William H. Crawford really thought about running, but he knew he would get his butt kicked by Monroe, so decided not to. Pennsylvania Governor
Good
Simon
decision.
Snyder and New York Governor Daniel D. Tompkins ran but withdrew before the Democratic-Republican caucus. Even though Monroe was widely loved, there was a growing number who didn't want him to get the nomination because he was yet another dude from Virginia. Some were weary of the so-called Virginia dynasty. Still, James Monroe got the nomination, which almost guaranteed him the presidency. Or did it? Monroe's running mate was Daniel D. Tompkins. I mentioned him earlier. Weren't you paying attention? Gosh. Like I said before, the Federalists didn't formally nominate anyone, but many Federalists supported Rufus King with John Eager Howard as his running mate. And here are the results.
Before we go on, I'm voting Monroe. Easy. I mean, Tompkins isn't extremely popular or anything, but I think that Monroe would lead the country far better than King would. And, I'm not a fan of the Hartford Convention at this point, so I'm turning my back towards the Federalists. I have this entire time. I mean, I wouldn't have been mad if John Adams won, but that's the literal only Federalist I've ever supported. Um, but yeah, I think that I would have voted James Monroe.
Results. First, there was a bit of conflict. When people voted in November and December, Indiana wasn't officially a state yet, but its citizens wanted their votes to be counted too. Some argue their votes shouldn't be counted as Indiana was still technically becoming the fifth electoral votes, with Rufus King receiving just 34 electoral votes. Monroe was the second James in a row to win the presidency.
1820.
Mr. Beat presents
Very quick election.
Presidential elections in American
I mean, I'll watch the video.
history. The ninth presidential election in American history took place from Wednesday, November 1st to Wednesday, December 6th, 1820. Oh, it was a weird one. Mostly because James Monroe was so popular that everyone was too afraid to run against him. That's right, folks. This was the third and final presidential election in which a...
I guess I'm voting for Monroe then. Next. Now, 1824 is one of my favorite elections to look at, and it's simply because of the fact that there were so many diverse
My job
and
is to
unique
make sure
candidates
that
running.
every voice is heard and every vote is counted accurately.
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in American History. The 10th presidential election in American history took place from Tuesday, October 26th to Thursday, December 2nd, 1824. It's one of my favorite elections to look at because it was so unusual and fascinating. First,
By the way, sorry I muted system audio last time. I didn't realize I did, and I'm not filming that portion of the video again. So yeah, let's do it.
of all, it's important to note that this was the first election in which white men came out in droves to vote. It used to be that only rich white men could vote in elections, but more and more laws now made it so that poor white men could vote because property ownership was no longer a requirement. So
Okay.
remember that later on. Okay, so James Monroe had a relatively smooth tenure as president and decided not to seek a third term, keeping the two-term tradition. His vice president, Daniel D. Tompkins, was lucky to be reelected back in 1820 because a lot of fellow Democratic Republicans didn't like him. In 1824, he was still in no shape to run for president because many still didn't like him. He had mismanaged his money and had a horrible debt, and he suffered from alcoholism and just overall poor health. Tragically, he died just 3 months after leaving office.
Wow.
There was still only one major political party at the time, the Democratic Republican
Republicans.
Party. Yet there was a power vacuum within the party. Because of this, a flood of candidates rushed in, all wanting to be president. The election ended up being more about each candidate's personality and regional rivalries because each candidate agreed on most of the major issues. Think of the primary elections and caucuses of today within political parties to get their nominee. That's basically what this presidential election was, except they couldn't agree on who would be nominated and therefore president. There were originally 6 Democratic Republican candidates who stood out. There was Smith Thompson of New York, who was the Secretary of the Navy. Seeing he had no chance against stiff competition, he ended up withdrawing from the race. Next up was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who was the Secretary of War. He also dropped out of the race later when he realized he didn't stand a chance. That left 4 other candidates who did stick it out. William H. Crawford, the Secretary of the Treasury from Georgia, had actually been nominated by a caucus of a minority of the Democratic Republican members of the U.S. Congress. However, the rest of Congress viewed the caucus as elitist and undemocratic, so they ignored it. Next up was Henry Clay, the well-known and well-respected Speaker of the House from Kentucky. He probably would have received his party's caucus nomination if he had wanted it, but he thought the caucus process was not the best way to elect presidential candidates. John Quincy Adams, oldest son of former President John Adams and Secretary of State from Massachusetts, tended to have support from many former Federalists. Finally, there was Andrew Jackson, the War of 1812 military hero, former governor and senator from Tennessee, who many viewed as a champion of the, quote, common man. Like I said, with the exception of maybe disagreements over tariffs and the government's role with infrastructure, these candidates agreed on most issues. This election was about personality and supporting the candidate voters could relate to the most.
I'm a little scared by Jackson's rhetoric at this point. I don't think Adams is the. You know what? I wouldn't be mad at Adams. I'm pretty mad at Jackson. I'm voting Crawford. I'm voting William Crawford in 1824.
it was very much a regional election. Crawford had much support in parts of the East, Clay had support in the West, Adams had support in the Northeast, and Jackson had support pretty much all over. Because the election was highly contested, there was heavy campaigning from all sides, with the exception of Crawford, who suffered from a stroke due to a bad prescription. You heard that right. However, back then candidates usually sat on the sidelines while their supporters did most of the campaigning anyway. In addition to the usual forms of campaigning, a bunch of parody songs popped up to support candidates, most notably Hunters of Kentucky, a parody of the song The Unfortunate Miss Bailey. Weird Al Yankovic would be so proud. Did I mention the vice president candidates?
Oh,
there were a
no.
lot. Let's see, we originally had Albert Gallatin, who was nominated by that congressional caucus that didn't count. Officially on the ballot come October were Nathan Sanford from New York, Nathaniel Macon from North Carolina, Martin Van Buren from New York, and the aforementioned John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. And here are the results. Well, the results were inconclusive.
Before he goes on, I already said I'm voting for William Crawford in 1824. Let's see who wins.
There was no clear winner. Andrew Jackson received 99 electoral votes, more electoral votes than any other candidate, but he did not receive the majority electoral votes needed to win the election, which was 131. John Quincy Adams came in second with 84 electoral votes, Crawford third with 41, and Clay fourth with 37. John C. Calhoun became the seventh vice president in American history after receiving 182 electoral votes. Good thing he dropped out of the presidential race, know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But who would be president?
I do know.
Well, the answer was in the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which said the House of Representatives would decide who would be president if no candidate received a majority of the electoral vote. Only the top three candidates would be considered, so this left out Henry Clay. Jackson, Adams, and Crawford remained. Remember, Henry Clay was Speaker of the House and extremely influential in Congress. Clay hated Andrew Jackson. In January of 1825, he told a friend, quote, "I cannot believe that killing 2,500 Englishmen at New Orleans qualifies for the various difficult and complicated duties of the chief magistracy,"
No.
unquote. Clay used his influence to convince more people to vote for Adams, whom he agreed with more on issues anyway, instead of Jackson. When the House voted on February 9th, 1825, John Quincy Adams was the winner, becoming the sixth president of the United States.
At this point, I see the corrupt bargain, and I see why Jackson's mad. But at the same time, I see that I like Adams, and that Adams is the president now, and that he'll be leading the country next 4 years, and I'm happy with that. So let's go on to the next election.
Eve to me is basically freedom. It's a
Guys, I'll be right back. Let me just pause my film. Alrighty, guys, I'm back. Thank you for waiting a second. What? Oh, okay.
giant open universe where you can do what
Mr. Beat presents Presidential Elections in
American history.
The 11th presidential election in American history took place from Friday, October 31st, hey, that's Halloween, to Tuesday, December 2nd, 1828. Uh-oh, we got a rematch. 4 years prior, after a four-way split with no majority candidate, John Quincy Adams was handed the election by the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson, who finished second in the House vote, thought the election was shady, accusing Henry Clay of a corrupt bargain to get Adams elected president so that Clay could be his Secretary of State. Just a few months after Jackson's defeat, the Tennessee legislature already renominated him for president, setting the stage for a rematch. There was no nominating caucus even held. Jackson's supporters, who called themselves, quote, Democrats, were rabid. They treated Jackson like a rock star. For the next 3 years, Jackson's support grew and grew. His supporters, also called Jacksonians.
I mean, geez, Justin, if you're not going to be grateful for them, I'll take a third pair.
Her earphones seem to be really irritating her.